Good afternoon. Welcome to my dining room table as we begin this week's Bible study. We finished up the study about revealing the mysteries of heaven last week, and this week we're branching out into something new. I'm really not sure how many weeks this will go. I don't know how many of you will really be interested in it, but it's something that has been in the news recently. We just recently went through a presidential campaign. We've instituted a new administration within the last month or so. And so therefore, I thought it would be interesting to look at what the biblical response to government should be. And one of the passages that I'll be using as probably the guideline for what we're going to be looking at is in Romans chapter 13. And I'd like to read you the first couple of verses that it states in that. And it reads this: "Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Consequently, whoever rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves." That's the text. Now, there's a lot into that text that we will be getting into to kind of parse it out and really see what Paul is trying to get at here. And when we look at dealing with government as a Christian and from a biblical standpoint. What started my interest in this, and this first week is going to be pretty much of an introduction to the study and a background buildup, so that we're talking from the same sheet of music here, because we have two divergent entities here. First, we have what the Bible has to say, and then we have civil government, which in our constitutional system are to be separate but equal, according to the amendments within our Constitution. Sometimes that gets misunderstood, I believe, and misplaced. And so therefore, as a study, it's important to start from some common ground as to where we're coming from and where we want to go. Like I said, I did this study, and I've thought about this after a long time of ruminating on the purposes of government and God's plan for mankind. Is there a purpose for government in God's plan for mankind? And this rumination started while I attended college classes and took a couple of elective classes for my degree in management and computer science. Now, the two classes that had the most effect upon me and really got me to thinking had to do with business law and social ethics. From the business law class, I learned a few things. The law is to a great deal, with a few exceptions, are based upon what is called the Napoleonic Code. And I'll get into that in a little bit in one of my footnotes here about what that means. Or it's law based upon Moses and the Bible. Secondly, that there's a lot of gray area in law as written by man. And finally, how through the interpretation of our Constitution, again, a document with a strong background from the scriptures, as to how far we as a nation have gotten away from the tenets of Moses' law. One of the footnotes I'd like to talk to you a little bit right now is about our Constitution. Not many people know much about it. For instance, when was the Constitution? I talked about the Mosaic Code here. Well, according to Jeffrey P. Gale, America's civil and criminal justice systems are grounded on the Mosaic Code. The law that is contained in the Torahs, which are the books of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, predates Roman laws and is the first to incorporate humanism and the democratic spirit into a written judicial code. 4 centuries before Christ, the Jews devised a legal system based on the dignity of man and individual equality before the law. Individuals accused of crimes were considered innocent until proven guilty, had the right to confront their accusers, were allowed to testify in their own behalf, were not subject to double jeopardy, and could appeal convictions. Now, if you're interested, there is an interesting book out there by Max de Montt called Jews, God, and History. And he has some observations about all of this. One is about the Torah. The Torah was a bold leap into the future, a giant stride ahead of anything existing at that time. Its concept of equality before the law, a law based on the written code, seems to be a Semitic innovation. And Mr. de Montt talks about the Mosaic Code was the first truly judicial written code, and eclipsed previously known laws with all its all-encompassing humanism, its passion for justice, its love of democracy. The laws were essentially divided into 3 categories. This is important. Those dealing with man's relationship to man, those dealing with man's relationship to the state, and those dealing with man's relationship to God. And we see that broken down in the 10 Commandments. The first 4 of the 10 Commandments has to do with our relationship with God. The last 6 of the 10 Commandments has to deal with our relationship among each other as humans. He goes on to state that the Mosaic Code laid down the first principles for a separation of church and state. In the Mosaic Code, the civil authority was independent of the priesthood. The priesthood was charged with the responsibility of keeping the government within the frameworks of Mosaic law. Just as the United States Supreme Court is not above the federal government, but is nevertheless charged with the responsibility of keeping it within the framework of our Constitution. Moses also laid down the foundation for another separation, which has since become indispensable to any democracy. He created an independent judiciary. There is a curious resemblance between the philosophic outlook of American constitutional law and that of Mosaic law. The federal government only has the power granted to it by the Constitution. The individual states can do anything not specifically denied to them. In essence, the Mosaic law also established the principle that the Jews could do anything not specifically denied to them. Instead of not saying do not and such a thing, do such and such thing, the law of Moses usually says don't do this or that. From where the Mosaic Law makes a positive statement, it is often either an amendment to a negative commandment or else hemmed in by a negative admonition, saying in effect, when you do this, then don't do that. The Ten Commandments, for instance, list only 3 do's, but 7 don'ts. The 3 positive commandments are, I am thy Lord thy God, observe the Sabbath, and honor your parents. The 7 don'ts leave little doubt as to what one is not supposed to do. By fencing in only the negative, Moses left an open field for positive action. This allowed the Jews great flexibility as long as they did not anything specifically prohibited. They could, like the individual American states, do anything they wanted to do. So we get down to a little bit about the history of the Constitution. When was it signed? Okay, well, first of all, let's look at the legal documents dealing with America. The first and most important document was the Declaration of Independence. This was signed on July 1776. It was written by Thomas Jefferson and it was adopted by the Second Continental Congress. The main points that the Declaration of Independence had to dealt with inalienable rights. In other words, those that are everybody's. Nobody can deny these rights, which were life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. It also covered that all are created equal, civil duty to defend these rights for self and others. Then came the Articles of Confederation. The 13 colonies originally was a confederation of states, and they were called the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union, which was an agreement between the 13 original states of the United States that served as its first constitution. It was approved after much debate. And this debate took place between July 1776 and November of 1777 by the Second Continental Congress, and it was adopted on February 15, 1777, and sent to the states for ratification. The Articles of Confederation came into force on March 1st, 1781, after being ratified by all 13 states. Now, a guiding principle of the article was to preserve the independence and sovereignty of the states, thus a confederation. The weak central government established by the articles received only those powers which the former colonies had recognized as belonging to the previous king and parliament. The limitations placed upon the central government and difficulties experienced by Confederated Congress in governing states led to the need for a constitution and a different constitution. So it came into force in 1789 and is the supreme law of the United States. The Constitution, originally comprised 7 articles, delineates the national frame of government. Its first 3 articles embody the doctrine of the separation of powers, whereby the federal government is divided into 3 branches: the legislative, consisting of the bicameral Congress. This is Article 1. The executive, consisting of the president and subordinate offices. This is in Article 2. And the judicial, consisting of the Supreme Court and other federal courts. This is Article 3. Article 4, 5, and Article 6 embody concepts of federalism, describing the rights and responsibility of state governments the states in relationship to the federal government, and the shared process of constitutional amendment. Article 7 establishes the procedures subsequently used by the 13 states to ratify it. It is regarded as the oldest written and codified national constitution in force. And it wasn't long before it already had to be amended. Because next comes in line was the Bill of Rights, what we call the Bill of Rights. And it comprises the first 10 amendments to the United States Constitution. These amendments were proposed following the often bitter 1787 to 1788 debate over the ratification of the Constitution, and written to address the objections raised by the anti-federalists. The Bill of Rights amendments add to the Constitution specific guarantees of personal freedoms and rights, clear limitations on the government's power in judicial and other proceedings, an explicit declaration that all powers not specifically granted to the U.S. Congress by the Constitution are reserved for the states or the people. The concepts codified in these amendments are built upon those found in other documents, especially the Virginia Declaration of Rights of 1776, as well as the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, the English Bill of Rights from 1689, and the Magna Carta from 1215. So, like I said, the first 10 were called the Bill of Rights. We're familiar with most of them. The First Amendment guarantees the right to the freedom of speech, press, and religion, protects the rights to petition the government. So the First Amendment protects the freedom of religion. The Second Amendment, which we're also familiar with, guarantees the people's rights to own and bear arms for their defense. The Third Amendment, citizens cannot be forced to quarter soldiers during times of peace. The Fourth Amendment, citizens cannot be forced to subject themselves to seizure and search without a search warrant and probable cause. The Fifth Amendment prohibits abuse of governmental authority and legal procedures, establishes rules for indictment by eminent domain and grand jury, guarantees the due process rights, protects citizens from self-incrimination and double jeopardy. The Sixth Amendment guarantees fair and speedy trial, and the rights to know the accusation and the accuser, and to find counsel and witnesses. The Seventh Amendment reserves individuals' rights to jury trial depending on the civil case in cases already examined by not be reopened by another court. The Eighth Amendment forbids exorbitant bails and fines and punishments that is unusual or cruel. The Ninth Amendment reserves the rights of citizens which are not specifically mentioned by the U.S. Constitution. And finally, the 10th Amendment reserves powers that are not given to the United States under the Constitution, nor prohibited to a state of the U.S. to the people and the states. And then there's 17 more amendments that have been added since then. I'm not going to go through all of those. If you want to know, I'll be happy to send you an excerpt of what all the amendments have to say. But that's what the Mosaic Code and what our Constitution is all about. So that was what I got from my law course. And I got from it that the law, I'll get into that in a little bit. The next class I had that really impacted me was one called Social Ethics. And it dealt with the many issues at the time: abortion, civil rights, and such. Most of this class dealt with past decisions from the Supreme Court of our nation with the background as to how the cases had come to the attention of the court, and all arguments that had gone into the justices coming up with their decisions both for and against a case. From this class, I came to the realization that the law written by the founders of our nations, like the Hebrew law, men decided that they had to interpret what the original intent of the original writers were against the societal norms as time progressed. So what do I mean by that? Well, we talked about the Torah a little bit in my first set of notes. But in my second set of notes, I remember reading a book sometime back by James Michener called The Source. The Source is a novel. Michener wrote a lot of well-researched, pretty much historical novels. And this one had to do with the three only monotheistic religions in the world. The first is Judaism, the second is Christianity, and the third is Islam. And in it, he mentioned something about all of the writings that were there for the Hebrews. And I had heard that it took up bookshelf upon bookshelf. So therefore, I wanted to research that a little bit. And so I have what I call here is the Hebrew Sacred Writings. And I took this article from the Israel's Ministry of Foreign Affairs and another document which helped me some. The first and most important document is the Tanakh, or their Bible, the Hebrew Bible. It consists of 24 books and contained in one volume, much like our Bible. But it's divided up into three divisions. The three divisions are the Torah, as we mentioned before, which actually means law. And it's the 5 books written by Moses, or the Pentateuch: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. These are the Torah, the law. Then you have the Nevi'im, or the prophets. And finally, you have the Ketuvim, which are the writings. After the Torah, then you have something called the Talmud. Now, the Talmud is a collection of rabbinical writings that interpret and explain and apply the Torah scriptures. It's also called the oral Torah. We would consider these something like commentaries on our Bible. And I don't know how many volumes there are for that. Then you have the Midrash. This is a collection of Jewish sermons primarily compiled from 4th, 6th century commentaries. How many volumes? I don't know. But I would imagine there's a lot. Then you have something called the Riposa. And what my notes showed me was that this was a vast collection, which consists of thousands of volumes. And these are answers to specific questions on Jewish law. Okay? I don't even know if you remember movies like Perry Mason or Matlock or one of these. Anyone dealing with a law office. And you have the law. The law, according to the Jews, is the Torah. The law of the land in the United States is the Constitution and the state constitutions. That's the law of the land. But now you have, as they say in Hebrew, the Reposa. This is the case law. These are all the codes and case studies and all of that if you look in any lawyer's office, takes up bookshelves and bookshelves and bookshelves to go through the different case law. This is interpretations of the law and precedences from the law based upon previous cases or cases that have set a precedence, a first time look at something different in the law. In the Hebrews, it's the Reposa. In our United States, it's the books that line any lawyer's office. These are the case laws. And it contains thousands of volumes for the Reposa. Then the Hebrews have something else called the Zohar. And it's the central text of Kabbalahism. Kabbalahism is the Jewish branch of mysticism, and it literally means the book of splendor. So you can see that I made a note that we have the original law that was written. God gave the law to Moses. The founding fathers gave us the Constitution. But in the 200 and some odd years since our nation has been founded, we now have volumes upon volumes upon volumes of case law, which are men interpreting what they felt the founders were really wanting to say. So you can see man starts getting involved in the law. Now, I remember a study, and I mentioned this sometime in some of my classes. Of course, one of the laws, thou shalt keep the Sabbath holy. Okay? Missioner mentions a couple of things that were probably in this Reposa or commentaries or whatever, which they started treating like real law. It was an interpretation. Well, there was the Sabbath distance came into effect. You could not travel over a Sabbath distance. There was so much distance that you could travel on a Sabbath day from your property. Your property. Here's the grub. Here's the rub. Here's the loophole. So what some of the richer people started buying, they would buy up property here and there and there and there that were within Sabbath distance of each other. Therefore, they could walk from here to there and never violate the Sabbath distance, the letter of the law. Remember when Christ came and was talking to them about the new kingdom and the principles of the kingdom, he's talking about the intent of the law. What did God really mean instead of what man tried to interpret into it? There was even one ridiculous instance of women weren't supposed to cook on the Sabbath. Well, bread is always better when it's fresh baked. So what would happen is the woman of the house would stoke up her place where she fix bread. She would prepare her dough and all that, and she would rest it on the side of where it was to be cooked with a stick propping it up. Therefore, when she walked past the stove in the morning and she accidentally hit that stick, the bread dough would fall into the coals and then it would be baked. Therefore, she did not violate the letter of the law because she didn't bake on that day. It was just an accident. So, like I said, from this, in man's interpretation of the law, I learned that our law and government are greatly influenced by opinions that people bring to the mix, and that there is no solid foundation to be found in man's law, for it is mercurial with the winds and the politics and changing norms. How does that happen? One administration may be conservative, another may be liberal. Therefore, the conservative administration puts in conservative judges. The Supreme Court is the prime example. Whoever the president appoints is there for life. Therefore, the influence of that judge on the court is there for life. Needless to say, Congress and the executive branch all are very adamant about who gets to be a Supreme Court justice or a federal judge. And the reasoning behind my decision was that the political scales tip from one ideology to another. That's what I was saying. Through our system, so does the makeup of our federal and state governmental systems of deciding what is right versus what is wrong. There can be no consistency as long as man is in the mix. Therefore, my conclusion from all of this ruminating came to be, where is the consistency in law? Is there anywhere that there is immutable principles of what is right and wrong? And of course, the answer is simply God. One of the very natures of God is that he never changes, and the law he puts down through Moses, the Mosaic Code, does not go away. The 10 Commandments are as valid and applicable today as they were when God gave them to Moses. One of the what God declares as sinful or against his law stays sinful. In the final judgment as to whether you or anyone has lived by that law goes before his court and not the court of man. Who's going to be the judge? The very same person who came to offer us salvation. Jesus Christ. Christians, those who are called children of God, will stand before the judgment of Christ. All others will stand before something called the great white throne of judgment that's mentioned in Revelation 20. Therefore, the only sure way to make true lasting change for equality, justice, and harmonious living as a society is to change people's hearts for God, not change laws or reinterpret laws. You might say then, what good is government? That is the reason for this study. Because in the study of the book of Romans, a scholar of the Bible finds out that God instituted government as a way for mankind to live in harmony together. So we get into this study looking at the biblical background into government. And is there any one style of government that best suits mankind to bring them into alignment with God's purpose? This study will start with some definitions that I've garnered from my studies about defining government, forms of government that have developed over the ages, and then the forms of government that are mentioned in the Bible and how effective they managed. First, a little bit of definitions. Simple definition of government. A government is a group of people that have power to rule in a territory according to the law. This territory may be a country, a state, or province within a country, or a region. Governments have the authority to have a police force to make sure people follow the law, or an army in case of the federal government and state governments. And there's all different types of government ideologies. There's a theocracy. This is a government that is ruled by a supreme being, in our case, God, giving a divine guidance to human intermediaries that manage the day-to-day affairs of the government. The original government of the Hebrews, until the time of Saul, was a theocracy. Then there's the monarchy. It's a form of government in which a person, the monarch, is the head of state for life or until abdication. There's aristocracy. It's the form of government that places strength in the hands of a small, privileged ruling class, the aristocrats. There's a timocracy. In Plato's Politics is a state where only property owners may participate in government. The oligarchy is a form of power structure in which power rests with a small number of people. These people may be distinguished by nobility, wealth, education, corporate, religious, political, or military control. Then you have democracy, the form of government in which the people have the authority to choose their governing legislation. Then you have the tyranny, which is an absolute ruler who is unrestrained by law or one who has usurped a legitimate ruler's sovereignty. Then you have anarchy, which we're pretty familiar with in our day and time right now, is a political philosophy and movement that rejects all involuntary, coercive forms of hierarchy. It radically calls for the abolition of the state, which it holds to be undesirable, unnecessary, and harmful. Let's just do away with all government. Then you have libertarianism, a political philosophy and movement that upholds liberty as a core principle. Note that we have learned some definitions to back up our thinking and arguments. Let's now look at the government system that forms the leadership of God with his people. And that's what we will be looking at next week. So I know that this is probably a lot of stuff that you got, but the bottom line is I would like you to look at Romans chapter 12 and Romans chapter 13 to get the context of what's going on with Romans chapter 13. When Paul starts talking to the Romans about government, you have to understand this was probably a very important issue to the people of Rome. So I hope that this will be of interest to you. and that you'll join me again next week as we start our next lesson. Have a blessed day and a blessed week. Goodbye.